Hi, friends. This week I left a breakfast in Springfield without staying for the toast. Not because I wasn't grateful to be there, but because somewhere between the tributes and the old campaign poster in the window, I realized I was looking at the exact moment Illinois politics stopped growing from the ground up and started getting planted from somewhere else entirely. So, this week on Deep Roots with Jen McMillan, we're going to be talking about a downstate billboard, a district that got redrawn out from under a congressman, and the 1,400 votes that changed how power works in Illinois for the next 40 years. Just a reminder, Deep Roots with Jen McMillan is your weekly-ish look at news and civic life across my favorite central Illinois counties, east to west. So, more to that story. I want to start out with something that happened to me personally earlier this week at a breakfast in Springfield honoring one of Illinois' longest serving politicians, Senator Dick Durbin. Because standing in that room got me asking a question I couldn't shake. Who represented this seat before him? And what did it cost to make the change? The answer took me back to 1982, to a Decatur billboard, a redrawn map, and a race that's still shaping downstate politics today. So let's start there. Around many states, the political season really kicks off at the state fair, and Illinois isn't any different. But as someone who finds herself questioning the two-party system in the United States on a regular basis, I wasn't sure if I was going to attend any of the events this year. However, as an Illinois Women's Institute for Leadership Training Academy alumna, when they asked for volunteers to work at the Democratic County Chair's breakfast, I couldn't say no. I couldn't say no to catching up with old friends and supporting my sisters running for office. So reluctantly, I got up early, dressed in my state fair appropriate black dress, and headed to Springfield. Once there, it was a bit overwhelming to see the tributes to one of our most famous politicians at his last chair's breakfast as our senator, especially in the room that he built. But as I left the breakfast, I spotted an older photo of Senator Durbin on a poster through a window. It was probably close to his election in 1982, 3 years before I was born. That's right, Senator Durbin has been my senator, our senator, since before I was born, which got me curious about who came before and how Senator Durbin got his start. That's how I figured out that one downstate Decatur billboard and those 1,400 votes changed American politics forever. You see, before Dick Durbin, his seat was held by another Illinois giant, who I didn't know very much about until this week. Congressman Paul Finley from Jacksonville, Illinois, a World War II veteran and journalist, held that seat from 1960 to 1983 and posed an almost insurmountable race to any challenger. And that was because Congressman Finley was well liked and well regarded in Congress. He was a farm kid from a rural county who worked himself up and never forgot to extend a hand back down. And those same farm communities, those were the ones that he represented in his district. Up until about 1981. Then a few things happened to shift the power structure, the boundary lines. In 1981, Springfield lawmakers couldn't agree on new congressional lines. So, for a third time in Illinois history, the map got handed to a panel of federal judges instead. What came out was a district that looked nothing like the one Finley had run in for 20 years. Gone was some of his safe, rural western Illinois base, and in its place, Decatur and Macon County, a traditionally Democratic stronghold he'd never had to win before. And Macon County was the pivot point. In the 1980s, Decatur and Macon County was struggling, feeling the impacts of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, changes in manufacturing, as well as a debilitating unemployment rate. This was Dick Durbin's chance. Now, Dick Durbin wasn't some political newcomer stumbling into a lucky break. He'd been legal counsel to Lieutenant Governor Paul Simon, then parliamentarian of the Illinois State Senate. The man knew Springfield inside and out. He'd even run once before for lieutenant governor in 78, and unfortunately he lost. By 1982, he was a private attorney with a tavern. He was polished, connected, and patient. He just needed the right race. Finley's Finley's newly redrawn district turned out to be exactly that. But that Decatur billboard and homegrown support that he'd built in Democratic Party circles wasn't going to be enough, not to unseat the very popular Congressman Finley. And, for better or worse, another group finally had a chance too. A then little-known group called the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. We just call them AIPAC now. Now, Finley and Durbin weren't AIPAC's first target. A few years earlier, they'd already gone after Congressman Pete McCoskey out in California over the same issue, his sympathy for the Palestinian cause. Now, McCoskey survived, barely, but he never held office after that. So by the time they turned to Congressman Finley, this wasn't some scrappy group's first swing. It was a playbook already being tested. And Finley's race is where that playbook got refined. AIPAC mobilized college volunteers from across the country. It leaned on a network of pro-Israel PACs to funnel money into the race, and it even made it hard for Finley to get anyone to show up to his fundraisers. And if Finley's own account is right, it may have gone even further than that. In some of his writings, he shared that of the 3 possible maps the judges considered for that 1981 redistricting, 2 would have all but guaranteed Congressman Finley's reelection, and 1 would have all but guaranteed his defeat. One of the 2 Republican-appointed judges on that panel broke ranks to side with the Democrat and produced the map that doomed him. Now, again, I want to be upfront that this is from Finley's own telling of it and not something I can independently verify. But whether or not that particular piece is true, what came after isn't in dispute. Just a few years later, the same model, mobilize, fund, and target, was repeated almost exactly in Paul Simon's campaign to unseat Charles Percy. It was then that everyone realized that these funds from lobbyist groups out of state really could make a difference. The change of district, coupled with a good candidate and extra money, changed that seat from a homegrown country congressman who supported civil rights and fought for rural Illinoisans to a fresh-faced Dick Durbin, who was a bit more polished, a bit more connected to unions, and a bit more pro-choice. We gained a lot from Senator Durbin over the years. But what have we lost? I argue that we've lost a model of how you win a seat in politics. The one where you build a political identity slowly, on being known and trusted by the specific people you represent. With Senator Durbin, I argue we saw the first real win for the new, current model of politics. The one built on redistricting math, outsider money, and national interest groups' strategic calculations that this particular race is winnable. And it's that loss of becoming a politician that made me leave the breakfast early. Me realizing that the room that Dick Durbin built wasn't really made for politicians like me. The ones who, when we ran our races, knocked on every door, not just Democrats. The ones who know we can't bully our neighbors into changing their minds, but have to find a way to live with fellow citizens, even with differing opinions. In my mind, Senator Durbin's ascent to Congress was the first death knell for moderate Republicans, for mavericks like Paul Finley and later John McCain. Because since then, at least in downstate Illinois, politics has felt less like a place with a real say in what happens and more like a battleground for a moneyed interest in photo ops. All that matters is moving around district boundaries to gain a sliver of advantage here or there and making the right connections to keep power and gain money. So no, I didn't stay for the toast. I got in my car and drove back through Springfield and back down through those corn and soybean fields that used to define this district before anyone redrew it. And I thought about what kind of politician I want to be if I ever get the chance to again. And I do have to note here that we, as Illinoisans, and me in particular, owe a great deal to Senator Durbin and his wife Loretta Durbin. Through their support and my participation in their I Will program, I've met so many allies and learned how modern politics really work. I am forever grateful to everyone in the room that Senator Durbin built. I'm just not sure it's the right place for me right now. Because I don't want to be the kind of politician who wins a seat because a map got redrawn in my favor, or because the right group decided my opponent was worth spending on. I want to be the kind who wins because the people 3 counties over actually know my name and trust what I'll do with it, even the ones who won't ever vote for me. A bit more Paul Finley or Glenn Pochard if you are a diehard Democrat. It's just not the model that Dick Durbin proved out in 1982. But I don't think it's gone. I think it's just been waiting for people downstate and across the country to pick it back up. That's where we'll leave Finley and Durbin for now. But politics doesn't stop at the state fair. So let's get into what's actually happening this week across our favorite counties in central Illinois. So a quick note, I have been for a while covering my favorite 6 counties, and I've gotten to even where I can read them off the top of my head. But what I've noticed is that news coverage in those counties is very sparse. So I have expanded again, and I am going to start covering 17 counties across central Illinois from the west edge to the east edge, all along the I-72 corridor. This week, let's start at the state level because there's 2 things happening in Springfield that touch every county on that road. First, the budget. Governor Pritzker signed our FY27 budget back in June, which was $55.9 billion with a B dollars, and notably, it's again balanced without raising income or sales tax on working families. Now, that's the 8th balanced budget in a row, if you're keeping track, a streak that matters if you remember the years-long budget impasse back in 2015 and 16, when the state went without a real budget at all, and it gutted social services in every one of our counties. This year's budget puts real money into housing, education, healthcare, and food assistance. And there's 2 things that I want you to know about specifically. First, it protects the 340B drug pricing program for our rural healthcare programs, and it supports disability services that advocates were really worried would get cut. And second, in Springfield, it's a topic that we keep coming back to, the data centers. If you've been listening for a while, you know I've been tracking this since the Honorary Americans episode on Abraham Lincoln and the Sangamon River. Here's where that stands today. Lawmakers introduced something called the Power Act this year. It would require data centers to supply their own renewable energy, report how much water they're using, and sign community benefit agreements with the towns they build in. The House held 3 separate hearings this spring, digging into energy and water use, as well as community impact. Mayors, labor groups, and farm groups all testified. And to be honest, it was genuinely contentious. Local governments, like the property tax revenue data centers bring in, farm groups, and myself, are worried about the land and water use. And labor's worried about the rules being too strict. However, the bill didn't pass this spring, and Governor Pritzker actually stepped in and paused new data center tax incentive agreements and directed lawmakers to keep working on it over the summer. So our real deadline is going to be the veto session in November. Here's how you can help. This is exactly the kind of bill that gets decided by who shows up. Lawmakers are holding stakeholder meetings through the summer and fall specifically to shape what gets attached to a bill before November. If data centers, water usage, or energy costs are an issue in your town, and for a lot of our rural counties they are, now's the time. Reach out to your state representative's office and ask how you can weigh in before November. Now, here in Decatur and Macon County, we are in the middle of a 3-year revitalization plan. That includes housing rehab grants, demolition, and redevelopment specifically targeted at 3 neighborhoods: Oakwood, Near East, and Jasper Street. Applications for that program are open through the end of the month if you know of somebody in those neighborhoods who could use it. Now, up in McLean County, this is a really neat one for economic development and schools. Rivian is fighting to lower its property tax bill in McLean County. And Unit 5 school leaders say if that fight succeeds, it could cost the district as much as $6.8 million in lost revenue. That is a real uncertainty hanging over how the district plans its budget for the year ahead. And this is exactly the kind of story that we really want to cover and watch over the next few months. Also, this week, everybody in our counties from McLean over to Champaign were issued flood watches and had storms again, even having a water rescue over in DeWitt County, I believe. The state issued a disaster proclamation covering McLean, Champaign, Ford, Marshall, and Tazewell counties. And that just means that it unlocks additional state resources for all the recovery efforts. Now, staying over in Champaign-Urbana, I do want to highlight something interesting that happened at their board meeting. There was a walkout. So there's been a question on their agenda for home rule, and that came up earlier this week, ending after only 3 minutes and before any member of the public could even speak on it. Home rule is a big deal. It affects how much local control a county has over its own taxing and regulatory power. And cutting off public comment on it, even procedurally, is the kind of thing that deserves scrutiny. On the school side in Champaign-Urbana, Monday was the first day back in Urbana, and it's the final year for Superintendent Jennifer Ivory Tatum. And I don't want to miss over in Vermilion County, I found out that Danville's Kiwanis Club is holding its 76th annual Pancake and Sausage Day this weekend at the Palmer Arena. All the proceeds go to local children's charities, including the Danville Public Library and Vermilion County Dare. So if you're over on that side by Danville, you should show up and contribute. And that's going to wrap it up for the news in Central Illinois this week across our now 17 counties. Again, you've been listening to Deep Roots with Jen McMillan. That's me. And this is just my simple attempt to pay attention to the place that I live. I'm a mom, a Rotarian, a part-time consultant, and depending on who you ask, something of a policy nerd. I spend my days working in community development and affordable housing across Central Illinois, and I spend a fair amount of my free time wandering old cemeteries and towns, trying to keep their stories from disappearing. This show covers 17 counties: Adams, Pike, Calhoun, Scott, Greene, Cass, Morgan, Menard, Sangamon, Logan, Christian, Macon, DeWitt, Piatt, McLean, Champaign, and Vermilion. Because I believe local government, local development, and local history are where the real decisions about our future actually get made. Not in Washington, not even always in Springfield. Right here in county board meetings and zoning hearings and school board votes that most of us never think to show up for. I'm not neutral about this place. I love it, I'm honorary about it, and I think it deserves better coverage than it gets. So that's what we're building here. One county, one story, one route at a time. If you've got a story in one of those 17 counties, let me know. You can always reach me at jen@jenmcmillan.com, or you can message me on any of the places that you found this podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Now, around many states, the political season really kicks off at the state fair, and Illinois isn't any different. And as someone who this week, I left a breakfast in Springfield without staying for the toast. Not because I wasn't grateful to be there, but because somewhere between the tributes and the old campaign poster in the window, I realized that I was looking at the exact moment Illinois politics stopped growing from the ground up and started getting planted from somewhere else entirely. Welcome back to Deep Roots with me, Jen McMillan, your weekly-ish look at news and civic life across my favorite central Illinois counties. Now, this week I wanted to tell you about something that happened to me personally. I had a breakfast in Springfield honoring one of Illinois' longest serving politicians, Dick Durbin. But because standing in front of that room got me asking a question I couldn't shake, I'm going to bring it to you. Who represented the seat before him? And what did it cost to make the change? The answer took me back to 1982, to a Decatur billboard, a redrawn map, and a race that's still shaping downstate politics today. So let's start there. Around many states, the political season really kicks off at the state fair, and Illinois isn't any different. But as someone who finds herself questioning the whole two-party system as a whole, I wasn't sure if I was going to attend any events this year. But as an Illinois Women's Institute for Leadership Training Academy alum, when they asked for volunteers to work at the Democratic County Chair's Breakfast, I couldn't say no. I couldn't say no to catching up with old friends and supporting my sisters running for office.